Montana Territory, November 1881. The most respected builder in Bitterroot Valley stood with his arms crossed, staring at the outline of stones circling a modest log cabin. Heinrich Adler had built 43 structures across 3 territories. He'd survived winters that killed livestock and froze whiskey solid in the bottle. And now he was watching what he called the most dangerous waste of labor I've seen in 20 years. The woman marking the stone positions didn't look up. Catherine Brennan, 34, widowed 8 months prior, had 3 children inside that cabin and one winter to prove everyone wrong. "You'll trap moisture against those logs," Adler said, loud enough for the gathering crowd. "Or I will take the whole structure in 2 years. If the weight doesn't collapse at first." Catherine drove another stake into the frozen ground. This is the story of how the worst idea in frontier building became the most copied innovation across 3 territories. Today, you'll understand what Catherine Brennan knew about thermal mass that even master builders missed, and why her method saved lives when the coldest winter in recorded history hit the Bitterroot Valley. If you want to learn one real survival technique every week that actually worked when everything depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this knowledge crosses every border. Catherine had arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1881 with her husband, Michael, and their 3 children, ages 4, 7, and 9. By August, a logging accident had left her alone with a cabin, 40 acres, and the knowledge that Rocky Mountain winters showed no mercy to the unprepared. She'd spent that first autumn studying every structure in the valley. She'd noticed something the men hadn't. The cabins that stayed warmest weren't the ones with the biggest fireplaces or the thickest logs. They were the rare few built against hillsides or partially dug out, structures with earth or stone on at least one side. The problem was universal. Standard log construction in Montana meant brutal morning cold, ice forming on the inside of walls, and with consumption so extreme that families spent half their waking hours feeding fires. Catherine had watched her neighbor, Samuel Hutchins, burn through 4 full cords of split pine in just 3 weeks of moderate cold. His children wore coats indoors. His wife coughed constantly from the smoke of an overworked fireplace. Catherine's plan was simple, radical, and, to everyone else, insane. She would ring her entire cabin with a freestanding stone wall, positioned 18 inches from the log exterior, rising 4 feet high, and capped with planks to shed rain. The gap between stone and wood would create a thermal buffer. The stone mass would absorb daytime solar radiation and release it slowly through the night. The air trapped between the 2 layers would act as insulation far superior to exposed log alone. The valley's response was immediate and unified: ridicule. Catherine began hauling stone in mid-September, working alone except when her eldest, James, could help after chores. She selected limestone from a dried creek 2 miles north, dense, flat pieces that stacked cleanly. Each stone was evaluated for weight, shape, and freedom from cracks that would split in freezing temperatures. The construction method was methodical. She dug a shallow trench in a perfect ring 18 inches from the cabin's base, filled it with gravel for drainage, then began stacking. No mortar. Each stone was placed a lock with the ones below and beside it, creating a dry stack wall that could breathe, expand, and contract with the seasons without cracking. The design had specific engineering features that the critics never bothered to examine. At the base, she left 6-inch gaps every 8 feet, ventilation ports to prevent moisture accumulation. The wall's height stopped at 4 feet deliberately, tall enough to block ground-level wind and provide thermal mass, but short enough to avoid shading the cabin completely. The 18-inch gap was calculated, not random. Closer would trap humidity. Farther would waste the radiant heat transfer. She topped the wall with rough-cut planks angled to direct rain outward, away from both stone and logs. The physics were older than America itself. Stone has a thermal mass roughly 3 times that of wood. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. During sunny winter days, even at sub-zero temperatures, dark stone exposed to direct sunlight can reach 50 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit on its surface. That warmth radiates inward toward the cabin throughout the night, creating a buffer zone of relatively stable air that insulates the log walls far more effectively than wood alone. The air gap functioned as a dead air space, one of nature's best insulators. Moving air steals heat through convection. Trapped air can't circulate, can't carry warmth away. The result: the cabin's log walls faced a microclimate 18 inches wide that stayed significantly warmer than the outer ambient temperature. But to Heinrich Adler and the established builders of Bitterroot Valley, this was nonsense. Stone pulls heat out of a structure, Adler insisted during a Sunday gathering at the general store. Everyone knows this. Why do you think root cellars stay cold? Stone is for foundations and chimneys, not for wrapping a cabin like a fool's blanket. Wilhelm Kruger, who ran the sawmill, was equally dismissive. She's building a tomb. That gap will funnel wind straight into the logs. She'll have drafts that make the whole cabin unlivable. And when that wall settles unevenly because she's not using mortar, it'll lean into the structure and damage the foundation. The criticism wasn't just technical. It was personal and gendered. That's not how a home should look, said Margaret Finch, the schoolteacher, to a group of women outside the church. It's graceless, oppressive, like she's building a fort instead of raising a family. Others were less polite. A rancher named Coleman DeWitt rode past one afternoon and shouted, "You hiding from the winter or from common sense, Catherine?" Even the children in the valley began teasing her sons. "Your ma's building a prison," they'd say. "Guess she's scared of snow." Catherine worked through it all, 6 days a week, dawn to dusk. 437 wheelbarrow loads of stone. 6 weeks of continuous labor. Her hands bled. Her back locked up on cold mornings. But by late October, the ring was complete. The cabin sat at the center of a low, circular stone fortress, strange and solitary against the valley's traditional log structures. Smoke rose from the chimney. Firewood was stacked inside the stone ring, dry and protected. And Catherine Brennan waited for winter to speak the only language that mattered: temperature and survival. Inside the stone-ringed cabin, the changes were immediate, but invisible to those who refused to look. By early November, Catherine noticed the morning routine had shifted. In previous years, when she'd lived in a standard cabin further east, the first task of every winter day was rekindling a fire that had died to ash overnight. The air would be so cold it hurt to breathe. Ice would coat the water bucket. The children would wake shivering under piles of wool blankets, and it would take a full hour of roaring fire before the cabin became tolerable. Now, even as November temperatures dropped into the teens at night, the cabin held a baseline warmth. The fire could die down to coals by midnight, and at dawn the interior still measured in the low 50s. Cold, yes, but survivably so without frantic action. The children woke without chattering teeth. The water bucket remained liquid. Catherine measured obsessively, using an alcohol thermometer her late husband had brought from Pennsylvania. She recorded numbers in a ledger each morning and evening. November 8th. Exterior, 19 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Interior, 52 degrees Fahrenheit. November 12th. Exterior, 11 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Interior, 49 degrees Fahrenheit. November 18th. Exterior, 6 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Interior, 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, her neighbor Samuel Hutchins was burning wood at a ferocious rate just to keep his family's cabin at livable temperatures. Catherine could see the smoke from his chimney, thick, constant, the mark of a fire being overfed out of desperation. She knew the valley was watching, waiting for her system to fail. One evening in late November, Heinrich Adler arrived at her door with 2 other men: Mason Pritchard, a stonemason from Missoula, and Virgil Crane, who managed the Territorial Land Office. They wanted to inspect the structure. Catherine let them in without a word. Adler walked the perimeter of the stone ring slowly, running his hand along the dry-stacked walls. Pritchard knelt to examine the foundation, checking for settling or cracks. Crane measured the gap between stone and logs with a length of rope. "No mortar," Pritchard said, his tone dismissive. "This'll shift and fall apart by spring." The gap's inconsistent, Crane added. I measure 19 inches here, 17 over there. Sloppy work. Adler crouched at one of the ventilation ports at the base of the wall. He put his hand near the opening, feeling for airflow. You've created a wind tunnel. I guarantee you'll have drafts inside by January. And when snow piles against this stone, the moisture is going to wick straight into those logs. You'll have rot by next autumn. Catherine stood on the cabin's small porch, arms folded, silent. Mrs. Brennan, Adler said, standing and brushing dust from his knees, I respect your effort. I truly do. But this system defies every principle of frontier construction we've proven over decades. Stone does not insulate. It conducts. You've essentially wrapped your cabin in a heat sink. When the real cold comes, and it will, you're going to discover you've made your situation worse, not better. Pritchard nodded. If I were you, I'd dismantle this before it causes structural damage. At least take down the north side where the wind hits hardest. Virgil Crane was more direct. People are talking, Catherine. They're saying this is dangerous, that you're risking your children on an untested theory. If something goes wrong this winter, if that wall collapses, if your cabin fails, there'll be questions. Official questions. Catherine let them finish. Then she said, quietly, the winter will decide. The men left, shaking their heads. But the criticism wasn't limited to men with professional stakes in frontier construction. The social judgment cut deeper. At the Sunday market, women Catherine had considered friends turned cold. Ruth Kellerman, whose husband ran the feed store, made a pointed remark within earshot. Some people think they're smarter than everyone who came before. Pride comes before the fall, and the fall in Montana can kill you. Younger men joked openly. Brennan's built herself a castle, one said. Guess she thinks she's royalty now. Even the local preacher, Reverend Amos Tyndall, used his sermon to make a veiled reference. We must build our lives on the solid foundation of shared wisdom, not the shifting sands of individual arrogance. Catherine's children felt the weight of it. Her eldest, James, came home one afternoon with a bruised cheek. He wouldn't say who'd hit him, but he muttered, They said you're making us look like cowards. Hiding behind rocks. Catherine knelt to his level. Cowards run from the truth, she said. We're running toward it. There's a difference. By December, the valley had rendered its verdict. Catherine Brennan was stubborn, foolish, and heading toward a disaster that would prove the old ways right. The stone ring wasn't innovation. It was arrogance. And winter, real winter, would expose it. But winter was already whispering a different story. The stone walls, absorbing every hour of pale winter sunlight, were warming to the touch by midday, even as the air temperature hovered near zero. At night, standing between the cabin and the stone, Catherine could feel the difference. A pocket of stillness, noticeably less brutal than the open wind 20 feet away. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself at church or at the market. She simply kept records, burned her carefully rationed firewood, and waited. Because in January, the Bitterroot Valley was about to face something no one alive had seen before. December 1881 passed in tense, ordinary cold. Temperatures ranged from the single digits to the low 20s. Snow fell steadily, but not catastrophically. The valley went about its winter business, feeding livestock, hauling water from partially frozen creeks, and burning wood in quantities that made the forest smoke like a battlefield. Catherine continued her measurements. Her ledger showed a consistent pattern. December 14th, exterior 8 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Interior 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood burned 1/4 cord per week. December 21st, exterior 3 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Interior 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood burned 1/4 cord per week. December 28th, exterior 12 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Interior 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood burned 1/4 cord per week. Samuel Hutchins, by comparison, was going through nearly a full cord of wood per week. His cabin's interior, when Catherine visited to drop off venison, felt only marginally warmer than her own despite the roaring fire in his oversized hearth. You still keeping that wall up? Samuel asked, more tired than mocking. Adler's been saying it's bound to fail when the hard cold hits. "It's still standing," Catherine replied. "For now," Samuel said. On New Year's Day, 1882, the Territorial Weather Observer in Missoula noted an unusual atmosphere pattern, a massive high-pressure system moving south from Canada, colliding with moisture from the Pacific. His report, distributed by telegraph, warned of extreme and sustained cold likely to reach Montana territory by mid-January. Most settlers ignored it. Montana winters were always hard. Warnings were routine. But on January 9th, the wind shifted. It came from the north, flat, relentless, and so cold it felt like inhaling broken glass. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 0. By dusk, it was -12. By midnight, -23. And it kept falling. January 10th dawned at -31 degrees Fahrenheit. No wind, just still, brutal, crystalline cold that made the air itself shimmer. Smoke from chimneys rose perfectly vertical, freezing into solid columns before dispersing. Nails became brittle and snapped. Leather harnesses cracked like dry leaves. Water thrown into the air froze before hitting the ground. And the cold didn't break. January 11th, -34 at dawn. January 12th, -37 at dawn. January 13th, -41 at dawn. By January 14th, the Bitterroot Valley was locked in an Arctic siege that would last 11 consecutive days, with daytime highs never rising above -15 and nighttime lows plunging past -40. This wasn't ordinary Montana winter. This was survival mathematics. Firewood consumption across the valley skyrocketed. Families burned everything: furniture, fence posts, tool handles. Men worked in shifts through the night, feeding fires that roared but barely kept interior temperatures above freezing. Children slept in layers, huddled together. Elders developed frostbite on fingers and toes despite never stepping outside. Ice formed on the interior walls of cabins, spreading like crystalline disease. At Samuel Hutchins's place, the situation was dire. He was burning wood faster than he could split it. His interior temperature, even with the fire blazing continuously, dropped to 28 degrees by dawn. His youngest daughter developed a rattling cough. His wife wrapped hot stones in cloth and placed them in the children's beds, a trick that worked for an hour before the stones went cold. Across the valley, the pattern repeated. People were running out of fuel. The cold was relentless, mechanical, indifferent. Heinrich Adler's cabin, well-built, traditional, solid, was holding at 32 degrees in the mornings despite burning wood at a ruinous pace. His wife, Greta, had moved their bed closer to the fireplace. They slept in coats. On January 15th, Virgil Crane made an emergency ride to the territorial office in Missoula to request assistance. Two families had already abandoned their cabins and crowded into the general store, which had a larger central stove. A third family was preparing to leave. But in the stone-ringed cabin on the eastern edge of the valley, something different was happening. Catherine's ledger entries told a story no one was ready to believe. January 10th. Exterior, -31 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Interior, 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Fire maintained at moderate level overnight. January 11th. Exterior, -34 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Interior, 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood consumption steady. January 12th. Exterior, -37 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Interior, 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Stone walls warm to touch at midday. January 13th. Exterior, -41 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. Interior, 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Children sleeping comfortably without extra layers. The stone ring was performing exactly as Catherine had calculated, but far beyond what anyone else had imagined possible. During the brief daylight hours, even in -30 temperatures, the low winter sun struck the dark limestone at an angle. The stone absorbed every available photon of thermal energy. By noon, the exterior surface of the stone reached 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt frost on contact. That heat radiated inward through the 18-inch air gap, creating a buffer zone around the cabin that stayed 20 to 30 degrees warmer than the ambient exterior air. At night, the stone released its stored energy slowly, steadily. The thermal mass acted like a battery, discharging warmth for 6 to 8 hours after sunset. The cabin's log walls, protected by this invisible shield, lost heat at a fraction of the rate of exposed logs. The result: Catherine could let her fire burn down to coals by 10 p.m. and still wake to an interior temperature in the low 60s. She was burning 1/4 cord of wood per week, while her neighbors burned 4 to 6 cords, trying to achieve worse results. But no one knew, because no one was visiting. The cold was too dangerous for social calls. On January 16th, the situation reached a breaking point. Samuel Hutchins, desperate and nearly out of wood, made the dangerous trek to Catherine's cabin. He arrived shaking, face red from cold exposure, breath coming in gasps. Catherine opened the door. The warmth that hit Samuel was shocking, physically disorienting. He stood in the doorway, stunned, as his body registered the temperature difference. Inside, the children were playing on the floor in regular clothes. No coats, no blankets wrapped around shoulders. The fire in the hearth was present but modest, not the roaring inferno he'd been maintaining. "Ow!" Samuel whispered. Catherine handed him coffee, hot and real. "The stone," she said simply. Samuel walked to the window and looked out at the ring of limestone. In the pale winter light, he could see vapor rising gently from the wall, heat escaping into the frozen air. He put his hand against the interior log wall. It was cool but not freezing, not covered in frost like his own walls. "I need to bring my family here," Samuel said, "just until this breaks. We're out of wood. The baby's coughing won't stop." Catherine nodded. "Bring them tonight." By the time Samuel returned with his wife and 3 children, word had already begun to spread. Something impossible was happening in the cabin everyone had mocked. Stay with me, because what happens next humiliated the correct method and changed frontier building across 3 territories forever. By January 17th, Samuel Hutchins's family had been sheltering in Catherine's cabin for 36 hours, and the contrast was undeniable. Samuel's youngest daughter, Emma, had stopped coughing within the first night. The dry, stable warmth, so different from the damp, struggling cold of their own cabin, allowed her lungs to relax. Samuel's wife, Margaret, slept for 9 consecutive hours, the first uninterrupted rest she'd had since the cold snap began. The children played quietly, their bodies no longer locked in the constant shiver of near hypothermia. Meanwhile, Samuel made the dangerous trip back to his own cabin each day to feed his livestock. Each return was a shock. His cabin, even with the fire out for just 6 hours, had dropped to 11 degrees inside. Ice coated the windows in thick, crystalline sheets. The water bucket was solid. The cabin felt less like shelter and more like a slightly warmer version of the exterior death trap. He began taking measurements himself, using Catherine's thermometer. Samuel's cabin, exterior, -38 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior, after fire burned all night, 29 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood burned in 24 hours, approximately half a cord. Catherine's cabin, exterior, -38 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior, with moderate fire, allowed to burn down overnight, 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Would burn in 24 hours, approximately 1/8 cord. The numbers were so extreme, Samuel initially assumed the thermometer was broken. He borrowed a second one from the general store. The readings matched. Catherine's cabin was maintaining interior temperatures 37 degrees warmer while consuming 1/4 the firewood. On January 18th, Heinrich Adler came to see for himself. He arrived mid-morning, accompanied by Mason Pritchard and Virgil Crane, the same men who'd inspected and condemned the stone ring in November. They'd heard the rumors from Samuel, but didn't believe them. Physics, as they understood it, didn't permit what was being described. Catherine let them in without comment. The 3 men stood inside the cabin, silent, absorbing the reality. The interior temperature was visibly, tangibly comfortable. Adler removed his heavy coat within 30 seconds, something he hadn't done indoors at his own home in a week. Pritchard walked to the hearth. The fire was modest, glowing coals with a few split logs, nothing resembling the bonfires they were all maintaining. "What's the temperature?" Adler asked. Catherine handed him the thermometer. 68 degrees, she said. It's been between 64 and 69 since the cold started. Adler looked at the instrument as if it had betrayed him. He walked to the window, opened it briefly. Cold air rushed in like a physical force, then closed it and waited. Within 2 minutes, the interior temperature had stabilized again. "Show me the stone," Pritchard said. They went outside, in the -36-degree morning. The contrast was immediate and brutal. But as they approached the stone ring, something strange happened. The air became noticeably less vicious. Not warm. Nothing was warm, but measurably less cutting. Pritchard put his bare hand against the stone. He jerked it back, startled. "It's warm." "Not warm," Catherine corrected. "Warmer. The stone's at about 42 degrees right now. It'll reach 50 by noon." Adler did the same test, then walked into the 18-inch gap between stone and cabin. The difference was remarkable. A microclimate sheltered from wind, insulated by trapped air, and radiating gentle heat from the stone mass. He put his hand against the cabin's log wall from the inside of the gap. It was cold, but nothing like the exposed logs on a standard cabin. "The air doesn't move in here," Adler said, his voice quiet, thoughtful. "It's dead air, insulating, and the stone absorbs solar energy during the day," Catherine explained. "Even in this cold, even with weak winter sun, dark stone gets warm enough to radiate heat inward. It releases that heat slowly all night. The logs never face the full exterior temperature. They're always buffered." Mason Pritchard, the stonemason, walked the full perimeter. He checked the foundation, the stacking, the ventilation gaps. Finally, he said, "It hasn't settled. Not a single stone out of place. The dry stack method is actually flexing with the freeze-thaw cycle. Mortar would have cracked by now." Virgil Crane was writing notes. "How much would have you burned since January 9th? 1 3/4 quarts, Catherine said. "Total." Crane looked up. Samuel Hutchins burned 4 cords in the same period and couldn't keep his cabin above 30 degrees. The men stood in the cold, the implications settling over them like the snow that had begun to fall again. "I was wrong," Adler said finally. "I didn't understand thermal mass. I thought of stone as a conductor, something that would pull heat out of the structure. I didn't consider it as a battery, something that stores energy and releases it slowly." He turned to Catherine. "You've built the most efficient winter shelter in this valley, possibly in the entire territory." By January 20th, the Arctic cold finally broke. Temperatures rose into the teens, then the 20s. The crisis passed, but the knowledge didn't. Samuel Hutchins stayed at Catherine's cabin through the end of January, not out of necessity, but to study the system. He measured, sketched, and asked questions. When he returned home, he began planning his own stone ring, a modified version using river rock instead of limestone, tailored to his cabin's orientation. Others came to see, some skeptical, some desperate, all of them confronted with undeniable evidence. The measurements were recorded in multiple ledgers now, verified by several witnesses. Catherine Brennan's cabin during the 11-day cold snap. Average interior temperature, 64 degrees Fahrenheit wood consumption. 1.8 cords total morning low temperature. Fire reduced to coals 58 degrees Fahrenheit daytime high. Modest fire maintained 69 degrees Fahrenheit standard log cabins. Average across 5 measured structures. Average interior temperature, 31 degrees Fahrenheit wood consumption. For 0.2 cords average, some as high as 6 cords. Morning low temperature. Fire burned continuously 22 degrees Fahrenheit daytime high. Fire roaring 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference wasn't marginal. It was transformative. In conditions where survival was measured in degrees and cords of firewood, Catherine's design delivered a 33-degree average temperature advantage while using less than half the fuel. One number became legendary across the valley. During the worst night of the cold snap, January 13th, when exterior temperatures hit -43 degrees, Catherine's cabin maintained an interior temperature of 62 degrees with a fire that had burned down to coals by midnight. Her neighbors, burning wood frantically all night, struggled to keep their cabins above freezing. The stone ring had done exactly what she'd calculated. And the old wisdom, the belief that frontier building had reached its perfected form, shattered like ice in the morning sun. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened in the quiet decisions of men who'd sworn Catherine's method would fail. By February 1882, Samuel Hutchins had begun hauling river stone to his property. He worked alone at first, embarrassed to admit publicly that the woman he'd pitted was the one who'd save his family. But as he stacked the first course of stones around his cabin's north wall, the side that took the worst wind, his neighbor, Coleman DeWitt, rode past and stopped. DeWitt was the rancher who'd mocked Catherine months earlier, shouting about her hiding from winter. Now he sat on his horse, watching Samuel work, saying nothing for a long moment. That the same setup Catherine built? DeWitt finally asked. Samuel didn't look up. Modified. I'm using river rock instead of limestone. Easier to source. And I'm only doing the north and west walls where the wind hits hardest. DeWitt dismounted. He walked closer, studying the layout. You measure the gap? 18 inches. Same as hers. Ventilation at the base? Every 6 feet. DeWitt crouched, examining the foundation trench Samuel had dug. After a moment, he said, I burned 7 cords of wood in January. 7. And my place still felt like a goddamn icebox. My hands are torn up from splitting, and I've got maybe 3 weeks of supply left before I have to start buying from the mill at criminal prices. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. I'll help you stack if you teach me the method. By late February, 3 more cabins in the valley had begun construction on stone thermal rings. Each adapted the concept to local conditions. River rock, fieldstone, sandstone for mesa country. Some built full rings like Catherine's. Others focused on the north-facing walls. A few incorporated the stone into tiered terraces that also served as root cellars and storage. The technique was spreading not through evangelism, but through undeniable mathematics. People had burned through their wood supplies at catastrophic rates during the January cold. Many had gone into debt buying emergency fuel. Families had suffered. In one cabin, the one everyone had mocked, had sailed through the crisis burning half the wood and maintaining temperatures that seemed physically impossible. Heinrich Adler, to his credit, didn't hide from his mistake. On March 3rd, he rode to Catherine's cabin with a proposal. He wanted to document the design properly, measurements, materials, construction sequence, and publish it through the Territorial Land Office as an official building recommendation. He asked Catherine to co-author the report. I'll put both our names on it, Adler said. The Brennan-Adler thermal mass system. You deserve the primary credit. I deserve the reminder that experience isn't the same as understanding. Catherine agreed, with one condition. The report had to include variations for different climates and materials so settlers across the territories could adapt it to local resources. It couldn't be a rigid formula. It had to be a principle. The report was completed by April and distributed through land offices in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho territories. It included detailed diagrams, material specifications, and, critically, the measured performance data from the January cold snap. The numbers were stark and irrefutable. Brennan-Adler thermal mass system performance, January 9th to 20th, 1882 interior temperature maintained. 58 to 69 degrees Fahrenheit exterior temperature range. Minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit total wood consumption. 11 days, 1.8 cords average thermal advantage versus standard construction. Plus 33 degrees Fahrenheit fuel efficiency improvement. 58% reduction in wood consumption standard log cabin performance. Same period, averaged across 5 structures interior temperature range. 22 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit total wood consumption, 11 days, 4.2 cords average. Several instances of interior frost formation, multiple families requiring emergency shelter. The report didn't just present Catherine's design. It explained the physics in accessible terms. Thermal mass, radiant heat transfer, dead air insulation, solar absorption. It noted that indigenous peoples across North America had used similar principles for centuries. Earthen lodges, sod houses, cliff dwellings, and that European root cellars and wine caves operated on the same thermodynamics. What Catherine had done wasn't invent something new. She'd observed, adapted, and applied principles that were older than written history. By spring 1883, just 1 year after the Great Cold, 12 cabins within a 50-mile radius of the Bitterroot Valley had incorporated stone thermal mass systems. Some are new construction, others were retrofits, with families adding partial stone rings to existing structures. The variations were creative and practical. The Hutchins hybrid, river rock on north and west walls only, leaving south exposure for maximum winter sun on the logs themselves. The DeWitt terrace, stacked stone ring doubled as a root cellar on the north side, with external access to the thermal gap. The Kellerman corner, stone ring focused on 2 corners where wind funneled hardest, using sandstone with high iron content that absorbed heat aggressively. The Pritchard innovation, the stonemason who'd once dismissed Catherine's work, built a full ring with an ingenious addition. A small masonry bench built into the interior of the stone wall, creating a warm seating area that absorbed heat from the stone and released it into the cabin. Each adaptation proved the core principle. Thermal mass positioned to buffer living space from extreme exterior temperatures could reduce fuel consumption by 40 to 60% while improving interior comfort dramatically. The method spread beyond Montana. A family relocating to Wyoming took the plans with them. A territorial surveyor shared the report with colleagues in Idaho. By 1885, variations of the stone ring design had appeared in homesteads across 3 territories, each tailored to local stone availability and climate patterns. Catherine herself became a quiet authority on frontier thermal engineering. She didn't seek attention, but when builders had questions, they came to her. She advised on stone selection, gap width for different wind conditions, and how to integrate the system with existing structures. She never charged for her knowledge. Heinrich Adler, for his part, became the technique's most vocal advocate. He built 2 demonstration structures, one with a stone ring, one without, and invited skeptics to measure the difference themselves during winter. The evidence was always the same. The stone-ringed cabin stayed warmer, used less fuel, and required less labor to maintain comfort. By the winter of 1886, the Bitterroot Valley had fully absorbed the lesson. The crazy idea of 1881 had become standard practice. New settlers arriving in the territory were advised to incorporate thermal mass into their cabin designs before their first winter. The local sawmill began offering stone hauling services alongside lumber sales. The broader impact was measured in survival rates, fuel costs, and quality of life. Families that once burned 6 to 8 cords of wood per winter, requiring endless splitting labor and significant financial cost, were now burning 3 to 4 cords while achieving better interior temperatures. Children spent less time huddled near fires and more time able to move freely indoors. The constant respiratory problems caused by smoke-filled, over-fired cabins decreased noticeably, and no one, not a single settler who adopted the technique, reported structural failure, rot, or any of the disasters the early critics had predicted. The stone rings stood, settled slightly but solidly, and performed exactly as Catherine had calculated. The system had one other unexpected benefit: psychological comfort. There was something deeply reassuring about the physical presence of the stone ring, a visible, tangible barrier between the family and the brutal exterior cold. It wasn't superstition. It was the embodied knowledge that the structure was working, storing energy, protecting the people inside through simple, reliable physics. In 1889, when Montana achieved statehood, the territorial building recommendations became part of the state's homesteading guidance. The Brennan Adler system was listed alongside log notching techniques and chimney construction standards, no longer experimental, but canonical. Catherine Brennan lived in her stone ring cabin until 1904. She raised her 3 children there, saw 2 of them marry and build their own homes, both with stone thermal mass systems, and became a grandmother. She never remarried. She ran a small trading post from her property, maintained a large garden, and continued to advise builders who sought her out. When she died at the age of 57, her obituary in the Helena Independent noted that she had pioneered thermal mass construction in Montana and saved countless families from winter hardship through practical ingenuity. Heinrich Adler, who had criticized her design so harshly in 1881, delivered a eulogy at her funeral. He said, simply, "She understood heat better than any engineer I've met, and she understood humility better than I did." The cabin still stands today, over 140 years later. The stone ring remains intact, settled, weathered, covered in lichen, but structurally sound. It's been documented by historical societies and studied by modern engineers interested in passive thermal systems. The measurements still hold. The stone moderates interior temperature swings by 25 to 35 degrees compared to unbuffered log construction. The lesson Catherine taught the Bitterroot Valley wasn't about one woman being smarter than established builders. It was about the difference between assumption and observation, between tradition and principle, between what everyone knows and what actually works. Stone doesn't pull heat from a structure. It stores it, stabilizes it, and radiates it where it's needed. Dead air doesn't create drafts. It prevents them. Thermal mass isn't a heat sink. It's a heat battery. These weren't new discoveries. They were ancient principles, rediscovered by a widow who refused to let her children freeze because that's not how it's done. The valley learned. The territories learned. And the knowledge became tradition, not because it was old, but because it was true. In the end, the wisdom wasn't in the stone. It was in the willingness to question, test, and trust the evidence over the crowd. Catherine Brennan didn't defeat winter with stubbornness. She defeated it with physics, patience, and the courage to be right when everyone else was certain she was wrong. The stone ring around her cabin wasn't a fortress. It was a lesson stacked one piece at a time, that survival isn't about doing things the way they've always been done. It's about doing things the way they actually work. Now it's your turn. Which part of Catherine's solution would you apply to your home today? The thermal mass? The air gap insulation? The adaptation of ancient principles to modern problems? Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, because this kind of knowledge doesn't belong to one place or one time. It belongs to everyone willing to learn from those who came before and test what actually works. And if you want one real, proven survival technique every single week, techniques that save lives when nothing else mattered, hit that subscribe button right now. The old ways aren't always the best ways, but sometimes the crazy ideas are the ones that keep you warm when the world freezes over. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.